Okay, if you can take your seats, please. We'll get started again. I know this is a lot of information to take in a short period of time, but that's what has been assigned to us, and so we will do our best to fulfill the assignment. We're going to start with chapter 5 of Daniel, and chapter 5, thank you. We're going to start with chapter 5 of Daniel, and we come to the time when the Babylonian Empire is conquered by the Medes and the Persians, just as the dream that God gave to Nebuchadnezzar indicated. So here we are in verse 1 of chapter 5. Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles and was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. So we know what kind of feast this was. It was a drinking feast. When Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. What was the point of bringing these gold and silver vessels that had been taken from the Jerusalem temple? What was the point of bringing them here? It was a poke in the eye of the God of Israel. As that here we are worshiping our gods and having a drunken fest to our gods, which probably involved far more than just drinking. And we're going to use the gold and silver vessels from the temple just to prove that the God of Israel is impotent and unable to do anything about it. By the way, Belshazzar was not directly the son of Nebuchadnezzar, as far as we can tell. It says here, Nebuchadnezzar, his father. Sometimes in Semitic writings, particularly also in the Old Testament or in the Tanakh, Av, father, and its equivalents can mean relative, can be progenitor. So it could be father, it could be grandfather, it could be great-grandfather. And we know, in fact, that Belshazzar was probably either the grandson or the great-grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. So we have time that has gone by here. So he says, we're going to bring those vessels out that my father took from the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the kings and the nobles and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Now, isn't that interesting? What does that remind you of? Gold, silver? Yeah, the statue. You see how it's being woven together here? We tell the whole story at the beginning, and then we begin to zero in on specifics as we go along. Always keep that in mind when you read prophecy. Of course, we didn't have wood. The only thing we didn't have was wood. We had gold, silver, bronze, iron, and stone. What do we learn from this? Well, the arrogance of Belshazzar is clear. He has not learned anything from his father or his grandfather, his great-grandfather. I mean, look what happens. Here's Nebuchadnezzar that comes out and confesses that there's one and only one God, and that he's a great God, and that he's the sovereign God over the whole universe, and that no one can stay his hand and tell him what he's going to do at the end of chapter 4, right? And then the next king that comes along in our story has totally rejected that, totally given up on that. He is poking his finger in the eye, so to speak, of the God of Israel, and he's having this drunken fest to praise the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. He tries to dethrone God by using the holy vessels robbed from the Jerusalem temple and praising the gods of silver, gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. The materials probably reflect items taken from the temple. There were wooden boxes in which there were incense and different, or at least there were wooden boxes that held certain kinds of things that the priests used to determine who did what, casting of lots and so forth. And so this really is an attempt to dethrone the God of Israel. And of course, as we've already said, the list parallels Nebuchadnezzar's dream statue. Suddenly, the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Now, you have to believe that Belshazzar just figured he'd had too much to drink. Right? Okay. But he wasn't the only one who saw it. Then the king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, "Any man who can read this inscription and explains an interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. Verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, "Keep your gifts for yourself or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father." Verse 20, but when his heart was lifted up and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne and his glory was taken away from him, until he recognized the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets over it whomever he wishes. Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all of this. But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. The hand was sent from him, that is, from the Lord of heaven, and this inscription was written out. Now this is the inscription that was written out, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. What in the world does that mean? Well, he tells us. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene means God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace around his golden necklace around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler of the kingdom. That same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. Wow. Would you have the chutzpah to go in and give that interpretation to a king who had power of life and death over you? But it's amazing, isn't it? The king said, "Wow. Fantastic, you interpreted my dream, even though it's terrible news for me." Let's first look at some lessons for the soul, and then we'll look at some interpretive issues. God hates idolatry in all of its forms. Don't think that we can engage in idolatry and get away with it. Don't think that God will look the other way when we engage in idolatry. It will not happen. Idolatry is subtle. And what is the root of idolatry within the human heart and human soul? I'll tell you what it is. It's pride. Do you notice that Belshazzar puts himself up as the greatest? And he's engaged in idolatry. Why is pride the fountain for human idolatry? Because idols are that which we can control. How do we control idols? Oh, by giving them food, by doing the things they want us to do, etc., etc. Oh, so we think. Right? And look at the way the pagans, when I was in Guatemala, up in the mountains, called Tenango, the fellow that was there was leading the group and took me for a tour, and we went down over a little mountain and a lake there, and there was, you could tell there was a few people there all dressed in the same dress. And I said, "What are these people?" He said, "Oh, that's such and such a priesthood from such and such a tribe up here in the mountains." I said, what God do they worship? He said, "They worship that log they're carrying." Yeah. I said, "You got to be kidding me." He said, "No, it never touches the ground. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, priests carry that log on their shoulders. They rotate every other hour or whatever, and that's their whole life, is carrying this log around. I say, really? Do they say, yeah. They believe that that log is their God, and they pray to it, and so forth and so on. I said, well, why do you think they would do that? He says, because they're deceived. It's satanic, right? It's demonic. But what does Satan try to get us to believe? That we're the most important and everybody else is less important than us. It's out of pride that we're controlled and moved into idolatry. What's the antidote to idolatry? Humble yourself before the mighty hand of God, and He will exalt you at the proper time. The opposite of idolatry is utter humility. You say, well, these idolaters, they humble themselves before their false gods. No, they don't really. They fully believe that they control the gods that they carry. God hates idolatry in all of its forms. Don't be party to it. Don't accept it in your home. Don't accept it in your heart. Don't accept it in your life. Don't give credence to it. God deserves our full 100% worship. Love Him with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. Don't give any up to any other being. If we fail to accept the lessons God teaches to us through the lives of others, we are destined to repeat their mistakes. You know, sometimes children will look at their parents and say, who are godly and say, oh boy, they're so ho-hum, you know. They just do the same things all the time, you know. They're going to Bible studies, they're going to prayer meetings, they're just talking about God all the time. What a boring life. Well, granted, it is the work of God in our hearts, is it not, that brings us to faith. But we are really foolish people if we don't learn the lessons of those who come before us. Belshazzar had a perfect example in Nebuchadnezzar. He had seen and heard, apparently, or at least had heard if he had not seen. He had heard what had happened to his relative, to his great-grandfather, whomever, whatever the relationship was. He understood that he had had visions that came true, that he had been sent out into the fields and acted and lived like an animal until he came to his senses, and then that he had confessed this God. Ultimately, it appears to be the only God, but he hadn't learned it. If we don't learn from those who come before us, we're destined to repeat their mistakes. Thirdly, God may work in ways we could never imagine to accomplish His purposes. I've never seen God writing on a wall. We've used that phrase before, right? I've said, you know, before I would leave Washington State and go somewhere else, God would have to write it on the wall. Well, guess what? God could do that. He could write it on the wall if He wanted to. He did it here. He may work in ways we never could imagine to bring us to the place that He wants and He desires. Here are some lessons in prophetic texts, in interpreting prophetic texts. In apocalyptic literature, symbols are cryptic. What does that mean? They're mysterious. They're secret. There may be play on words to develop the meaning intended. Take, for instance, the phrase, Mene, Mena, Tekel, Ufarsin. What does this mean? What do the words actually mean? Mene is a weight, okay? And it was equal to 50 or 60 shekels. We have the Hebrew manah, however, which, okay, maneh in the Aramaic is spelled with an aleph at its end. Manah is spelled with a hey at its end, but it's essentially the same word. So in Hebrew, manah means to reckon or to count. Maneh is a weight when you say it in Aramaic. It's the verb to reckon or to count in the Hebrew. Tekel in Aramaic is the same as Hebrew shekel. Okay? Because oftentimes between Semitic languages, an SH sound is represented by a T sound in other Semitic languages. So you have a sheen and a tav interchange. So tekel means shekel in Hebrew. But the exact same word, tekel, in the Hebrew can also mean to weigh. Nice little play on, we call these puns, right? You have to know a language well to understand puns. I could tell you a joke and none of you would laugh because I think most of you wouldn't. Well, I shouldn't say that. Some of you would understand it. But there are certain puns that you have to be, you have to be an American, speaking American English to understand the pun. You see what I'm saying? Well, Daniel was a Hebrew, but he knew Aramaic. And so he says, when I hear tekel, it means shekel, but there is a Hebrew word tekel which means to weigh. It's the nifal of kalal, takal. You are light, to weigh, to be light in the balance. And then the term farsin comes from paras, which is another weight, a half shekel. So when you put it into the plural, farsin, it means two of them, 2 half shekels, which means 1 shekel, right? But the word, the consonants, paras, also means Persia. So paras can mean a weight, but it can also mean, it's the same consonants with different vowels that means Persia. Now you understand the play on terms. Thus the double meaning is applied to Daniel's interpretation, right? So literally it's saying, a maneh, that is 100 shekels, a shekel, and a couple of half shekels. That's literally what it says. It would be like we'd saying, $100, no, I can't say $100 bill. Do you have 100 peso? Okay, that's not very much money, but anyway, you get it. 100 peso, 20 peso, and what? 10 peso. What's the smallest coin you have? One peso? Okay, so that you get the idea, right? If you were using American money, it would be like a $100 bill, a $100 bill, a $10 bill, and a penny, or a $1 bill, or something like that. But when we see the way the words could be understood in Hebrew, it means you have been counted, you have been weighed, and you're too light. It's a double meaning. Now, how did I come to that double meaning? Through the historical, grammatical interpretation. I looked at the words and their meaning in the Aramaic and in the Hebrew, right? In their context, in the history, and in the culture. And when I did that, I now can understand why Daniel said the interpretation is, you've been put in the scales, you've been reckoned, you've been weighed, and you've been found light. Right? Okay, so we can do it this way. We can say, meneh on one side, which makes it heavy, and tekel ufarsin, which makes it light. We could say meneh would be equal to 100, and tekel and ufarsin would be equal to 2. God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you've been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Your kingdom has been divided, paras, and been given to the Persians. Media and Persian. Okay, so here's just a perfect illustration of what I've been saying all along, and it is this. The best way to interpret prophecy is to use the historical, grammatical interpretation, find the meaning of the words in the culture, in the time, and then see how it fits in the context. There are also what we call assonants, words that sound alike. So the word paras sounds a little bit like parez. What does parez mean? To divide. And so that's where we see Daniel using these kinds of understandings of the word to give the proper interpretation. All right. Is that clear? Did you get that? Is that too? It's kind of complicated. But You can see how these words can be used, particularly in apocalyptic and prophetic texts, to have more than one meaning. But how do we know that it has more than one meaning? Not because it has a meaning that's hidden, but because when we look at the words and we see them in their context, we understand the fact that it can be seen two different ways, or even three. And that's what's intended by the author. Okay, let's go on to Daniel 6. We won't get through this probably, but we'll get started on it before we eat lunch. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps, and of course Darius is the king of the Medes and the Persians that has now conquered Babylon. Belshazzar has been killed. So he appoints 120 satraps, this would be lesser governors, over the kingdom that would be in charge of the whole kingdom. Verse 4, then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. They could not find ground of accusation or evidence for corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Now there's a lesson to be learned right there. When you're working even in a foreign government, do the best job you can. Work for the Lord first, and only for your employer second. If you work for the Lord first, your employer will be very happy with you. You will give him or her the time that you're being paid for. You will give him or her the energy the mental energy, your talents, so forth and so on. And when God blesses you, he will bless your employer. And when your employer is blessed, then probably you'll get blessed too. Right? So here we have very good instruction and wisdom of what was going on. Daniel was a man of integrity. Even in a place he didn't want to be, he did what was right and what was good. They could find nothing in him to wage accusation against him. Then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. In other words, they said, we're not going to be able to do him in by his work. The only way we'll be able to do that is by attacking his religion, his faith. Then these commissioners and satraps came in by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, does this sound like a repeated theme or not? What do you think that might tell us about the end times? Do you think that the possibility exists? Because remember, the near prophecy helps give us an indication of what is distant. Okay? Not always tat for tat, point for point, but in general themes. Do you think that at the end of times that there will be a requirement that people all over the world worship a pagan god? Yes, remove the 10 Commandments. It's, as you mentioned that, remove the 10 Commandments. I think it's kind of ironic. The United States of America left the 10 Commandments behind a long time ago. So the fact that it happens to hang up in a few of the courthouses really is almost just irrelevant. You can have something hanging on your wall with the 10 Commandments, but if you don't live according to them, what does it matter, right? So if it's possible that we have this same motif, right? Nebuchadnezzar puts up a statue. Darius puts up a statue. All of these leaders, these world powers say, worship me, or at least worship me as a false god. What are you and I going to do when it comes down to saying, if you don't worship this false god, you're going to be executed? It's not a very nice thing to think about, is it? Can we stand firm in our faith? Can we say, no, I will not. I will not bend my knee to a false god. I will stand firm for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, let's start now enforcing our resolve to that end. Then they say, All the commissioners of the kingdom have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now, in his roof chamber, he had windows open towards Jerusalem. Why is he praying towards Jerusalem? Anybody know? Because it is the place that God has chosen. And in 1 Kings, when Solomon dedicated the first temple, what did he say? O God, when anyone, wherever they may be, when they turn and direct their prayers towards this place, will you hear and will you answer? Now, that's not some kind of a magical thing. It's not some kind of a prescription that if you pray in one direction, God's going to hear, and if you pray in another direction, he's not. No, that's not it at all. You know, like if you're driving in your car and you begin to pray, you have to turn around and face Jerusalem. No, don't do that. Okay, please don't do that. Okay, but what's the point? Is that in praying towards Jerusalem, the point is that we are confessing and acknowledging that there is one God and only one God, and that he has decreed that he would put his name and his heart and his eyes there forever. That's exactly what you read in 1 Kings 8. So when in our synagogues, for instance, or in our assemblies, or in our Bible studies, when we stand to do the Shema and we turn and we face towards Jerusalem, we're doing what is said in 1 Kings 8 and was modeled by Daniel himself. He wanted the people to know that he was still confessing only one God who really hears prayer. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. Shouldn't he have closed the curtains? Wouldn't it have been wise to close the curtains? You know, whenever I travel like this, and I know you all are the same when you travel, I miss my family. I miss my wife. I miss my children. I miss my friends, but I mostly miss my wife. And before I left, she came to me with a straight face. She was very serious, and she said, "Sweetheart, will you promise me that if you're in a place in the Philippines where there are a lot of Muslims, you'll take your kippah off?" Take this off, kippah. Well, she has every right to ask that because the kippah is not a requirement of Torah. It's a tradition of men. So I can go without it if I decide I want to. But then we had this short discussion. I said, "You know, don't you, that God will protect me? And even though I must be wise and I must be careful, still, you don't need to worry. And you don't need to fear. God will protect us." And so we can be who we are without being arrogant, without being in your face, without, beating people over the head with our religion. We don't need to do that. But we can be who we are, and we can be who we are in the face of those who disagree with us, and trust that God will protect us and God will care for us. So he didn't pull the curtains. He knelt down in his place as he always had done. It says, as he had done previously, praying and giving thanks before his God. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. "Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast in the lion's den?" How did they know that he wasn't praying to Nebuchadnezzar? What do you think? Because that's not how you pray to Nebuchadnezzar. You go over to where the temple is or something like that. You pray towards the temple of Nebuchadnezzar, not towards Jerusalem. Then the king replied, "The statement is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked." Then he answered and spoke before the king. "Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day." Then, as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. Why? Well, Daniel had proven himself to be a man of integrity. And even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, "Recognize, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed." Then the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Your God whom you constantly serve will himself deliver you." Verse 19, Then the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den. When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a trembling voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you constantly serve been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel spoke to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime." What a wise answer. What a wise answer. What are some practical things we learn from this? Sometimes government officials make stupid laws. And the people suffer as a result. Those of you that are in government positions, you ought to regularly be calling upon God for wisdom, because your decisions touch a lot of people. And those of you, we can make a principle here. Any of us who are in charge of others, any of us who are teaching others, any of us who are leading others, we ought to be careful to find the wisdom that comes from God, because we are affecting a lot of people's lives. So some lessons for the soul from this 6th chapter. Daniel continued his life of faithfulness even during great trial. I know that not everyone has the same strength of character and strength of spirit. But it's amazing to me how many times I see people who begin to go through difficult times, and the first thing they do is withdraw from their community. When you're going through difficult times, you know what you need more than anything? To be with others who will strengthen you. That's so humbling, isn't it? It's humbling to come and admit to people that you have weakness or that you're struggling in your life with things. That's so humbling and so difficult. But if we humble ourselves before the mighty hand of God, He will exalt us in due time. So he continued his life of faithfulness even during great trial. Grow your faith now if you want to be strong in times of trouble. Daniel knew that he served a God who is able to deliver. He had no doubt about that. If previous prophecies have been fulfilled in exactly the way they were given, we can be assured that prophecies for the end times will also be fulfilled. All right? Don't think that, well, it happened back then. I mean, are you with me on this? It seems like, man, I've never seen a handwriting on the wall. I've never seen people thrown into a fiery furnace and come out without even, smoke smell. I've never seen anybody thrown into a lion's den and come out alive. I mean, I've never seen that. Do I have to have miracles like this in order to have faith like this? The answer is no, you don't. What do you need to do? Believe that what the Word says is true. Did this happen in the time of Daniel? Yes. Can God make it happen in your time if need be? Yes. There's where our faith grows. The greatest lesson to learn from prophetic texts is that God is in control of all things, and we must live now in light of that truth. Here are some things to learn in terms of interpreting prophetic texts. The prophecies fulfilled in the near future give insight into the prophecies that relate to the distant future. All right? So get ready for it. Do you think that there's coming a time when we will face the challenge of whether or not to obey those who have authority and with regard to giving our worship to the one true God? Yes, we will. More than likely, this is what will happen. The overthrow of Babylon by Medo-Persia makes certain that Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream state was correct. Okay? Babylon is the golden head, right? Medo-Persia is the silver, and Medo-Persia took over Babylon. It happened in history. You can read it in the history books. When we see these prophecies being fulfilled exactly as they were given, it gives us great courage and strength to know that the prophecies not yet fulfilled will be fulfilled just as they were given as well. This made it clear that Medo-Persian would also fall to another power, right? Medo-Persian is not going to last. Someone else is going to come along and overtake them. So, let's summarize. The whole story is given to us in chapter 2. It starts with the head, which is Babylon. And then we go to the next chapter where Nebuchadnezzar erects this huge statue of himself, this golden statue. They are thrown into the fiery furnace. And there is one like the Son of God, or some might translate it, Son of the Gods. So chapter 3 takes us just to the point of Babylon. It talks now just about the head, not about the whole statue. We go then to the dream of the tree, and the fact that the tree is cut down and a stump is left, and Nebuchadnezzar is out in the fields living like an animal, feeding on the grass in chapter 4. So chapters 3 and 4 give us the kind of the demise of Nebuchadnezzar and ultimately his confession of the one true God. And then in chapters 5 and 6, chapter 5, Babylon is conquered by the Medo-Persians. Belshazzar is the son of Nebuchadnezzar. We understand that to be relative. And he sees the writing upon the wall, the Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, which tells us what? That his kingdom, that Belteshazzar himself is going to die, and his rule is going to be taken away from him in chapter 5. And then what happens? We have chapter 6, an indication of the Medo-Persian Empire in chapter 6. So it's the silver part of that statue. And we have the statue of Darius erected, and Daniel refusing to pray to him, but prays instead to his one true God. And he is thrown into the lion's den, but he is rescued. So Daniel's God is proven to be more powerful than the gods of Darius, and that is precisely the message that is repeated over and over and over again in Daniel. Now, without looking at your books, okay, chapter 1, we have the story of the four, Daniel, right, and his four companions, and they wouldn't eat the king's food, right? Okay, and so they were given vegetables instead, and it worked great, okay? Chapter 2 has what? The statue, okay? So think of chapter 2, the statue, okay? With 4 different kinds of metals, and then clay in the feet, all right? And the rock taken from the mountain. Okay, what happens in chapter 3? Nebuchadnezzar erects the golden statue, right? And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to bow to it. What happens to them? Fiery furnace, right. So chapter 1 is vegetables. Chapter 2 is a statue. Chapter 3 is fiery furnace, okay? Chapter 4 is what? The tree, right. He has the dream of the tree. The tree is Nebuchadnezzar, who is going to be cut down, and he's going to be in the fields, and so forth and so on. Chapter 4. Chapter 5 is what? Belshazzar, right? Okay, the hand writing on the wall. So chapter 5 is hand, okay? So we have vegetables, statue, fiery furnace, tree, hand, okay? And remember that whole story, many, many tekel upharsin, right? And chapter 6 is Darius, and he puts his statue up that everybody is to pray to. So chapter 6 is prayer, okay? And Daniel kneeling and praying towards the temple, the city of Jerusalem. Okay? So see, you got the first 6 chapters of Daniel in your mind, right? You can now work through them and keep in context what goes on in those 6 chapters, because it's going to be important for chapters 7 through 12 for you to remember what happened in 1 through 6. All right.